Cinderella goes back a long ways at the studio. Their script's going back to the 1930s.
When they finally decided to do Cinderella in 1948, it was at a time when they weren't really sure what was going to happen to the studio financially.
The word believing is all the way through this movie. And usually, if Walt believed hard enough, it worked for him.
I think that he was rolling the dice and praying. I think he did a lot of that.
It was very typical of Walt to go out on a limb and take a risk. And in some ways, you know, this was the biggest risk he took.
Walt had not had a big financial success since Snow White. Snow White, that was it. By the end of the Second World War, he was $4 million in debt.
If Cinderella had lost money, I think that would have been the end of Disney animation, or at least the end of Disney feature animation, because although Snow White had been such a huge hit, Pinocchio and Fantasia had both lost money the first time out.
It's true. The studio went through very hard times, particularly during the war years. In fact, they were kept afloat by training films for the United States government. And the South American films that they made for the Good Neighbor policy of Roosevelt. So Walt and Roy decided that the way they could save the company would be through diversification. So they started to do live-action films. They started to put together short cartoons into a feature format. That's why you see films like Make Mine Music and Melody Time.
And they did okay, but they weren't really big hits, and they didn't really establish Disney storytelling as he had done.
They made back their costs anyway, but you can't keep in business very long. It was a question of survival. And let's make a feature, or let's sell the business.
Walt remarked, we need a story with a girl in trouble. That usually works. You know, Snow White just worked.
Everybody loves a story of an underdog. We love a story where you are rooting for this girl to rise up above the oppression.
Well, believe it or not, I think that Walt identified with that. Walt was from a humble background. He had big dreams, big hopes, but he had nothing to start with except his imagination. And with his imagination, he built an empire. He built a world.
Walt had a pretty tough childhood. He had worked on a farm. He had delivered newspapers when it was 25 degrees below. And yet he believed in the Hollywood dream, the American dream. He felt that he had achieved that dream himself and that he somehow had this power to give it to people.
And here, encapsulated with this one little poor, pathetic little girl who's been put upon, and she has nothing, some wonderful things happened to her.
I think part of the reason Walt Disney had to have been attracted to Cinderella, and some of the reason that I'm attracted to Cinderella, is because I'm a Cinderella story. I started off as a poor kid, and here I am. Walt started off as a poor kid, and he became Walt Disney.
I think at the heart of all of the classic Disney films is transformation. That's what we're animating. We're animating those moments. For Pinocchio to become a real boy, for Cinderella to imagine herself as chosen by the prince and dressed in this beautiful gown.
The transformation scene of Cinderella in rags into Cinderella in that beautiful ball gown, Walt Disney said was his favorite piece of animation.
I must say I've always felt very good about it. I don't think it's the best piece of animation ever done, but it was something that hit the heart and it struck Walt.
Which, of course, comes from a man who loved the idea of transformation in life into something better, bigger, grander, more beautiful.
We all have dreams like that. I think that's one major reason this story has been told for 900 years.
There are 90,000 variations of the Cinderella story, and Walt Disney knew the power of it. It has all the great elements. Every girl wants to meet a prince. Every prince wants to meet a beautiful girl.
It's a story that everybody knows. But Walt took that story and made so much more of it. One, he took the basic story and created these wonderful scenes that make that story so much more effective and cinematic. I mean, take, for example, the scene where the two ugly sisters tear the ball gown of Cinderella. I mean, that is quite a dramatic scene. And that's a very, very effective way of getting that story over. But he then set up this parallel story with the animals.
Walt and his crew came up with this wonderful subplot, the mice and the cat.
And the only thing holding these two stories together is Cinderella herself. But Walt set them up in this marvelous counterpoint.
It's one of those classic films that you can hang entertainment on, because the story is so bare bones in a way. You know, it's good and evil, and it's, you know, triumphing, you know, at the end. But on that framework, they're able to hang so many wonderful, entertaining bits and bring out such interesting personalities.
All those wonderful things that happen, the shoe breaking, is the Disney version. It's a very, very good story. Very, very well told.
And for 3 generations of Americans, a Cinderella story means Walt Disney's telling of the story, because it's told so well.
Thank you.
Had Cinderella flopped, there wouldn't be any Walt Disney animation afterwards. And luckily, it was a huge hit. It was almost its own story from rags to riches.
I met Walt Disney just a year after he'd made Cinderella. And he invited me to come to his studio. And one by one, I met all of these, what they call the 9 old men.
The 9 Old Men, Walt's tour de force group of artists, all worked together on Cinderella. These were men at the top of the game.
They were the people who really saved Disney animation after World War II. There had been some wonderful animators before them who had contributed a tremendous amount to the creation of the Disney animation style, but they were the key figures in keeping the Disney animation style going from 1945 really up into the 60s.
They were so excited with the glory of what they had wrought. And they told all these stories about the making of Cinderella.
Walt Disney really knew what the strong sides were in the animators, and he cast them accordingly. The casting on Cinderella was really perfect.
Eric Larson and Mark Davis were equally skilled as draftsmen, and they were assigned the difficult task of animating Cinderella.
There are certain scenes in the film that when I think of the scene, I think of the person who animated them. When Cinderella wakes up in the morning, it's so much like Eric. Eric was our mentor when we started at Disney, and he was
a grandfatherly guy with a nice portly belly, and he would talk like this, and he was
always sincere and very genuine and heartfelt. And when you see that scene, you just feel everything is right in the world. And I feel like I felt back at Disney in the room next to Eric Larson when I'd go in and work with him.
I remember Eric Larson talking about the fact that he and Mark Davis, they didn't quite see eye to eye in terms of Cinderella.
All right, breakfast is served.
Mark Davis apparently gave her a more sophisticated quality, whereas Eric Larson went for a simpler character, and they had to somehow reconcile the two sides of the character. But I think that's what makes her interesting too, that she does have this down-home warmth to her, but there's also a certain intelligence and sharpness about her.
Maybe I should interrupt the music lesson.
And I think it has something to do with Mark Davis's approach to the character.
This is sort of a doodle sheet that Mark Davis did during the making of Cinderella, and you can see this is probably early on where he's analyzing her face.
So this is love.
Milt Kahl, who was the top draftsman at the studio, was always stuck with the princes. Very difficult to do these straight masculine characters without making them look silly. Milt Kahl also had scenes with the Duke and the King.
It's high time he married and settled down.
Of course, Your Majesty.
Milt Kahl did these drawings of the king. Milt was always a master at hands. They were always so correct and very, very expressive.
Milt did the fairy godmother. That scene with the fairy godmother is unforgettable.
Good heavens, child. You can't go in that.
The fairy godmother has surprising warmth. There's this grandmotherly type, you know, who has a lot of softness. There's a lot of nice feeling to that character.
Everyone's talking about it. The whole kingdom.
Frank Thomas did the villain in Cinderella. The most hated villain of all the Disney villains.
Frank Thomas had done Bambi. He'd done The Seven Dwarfs. He did Pinocchio. All these wonderful, charming characters. And he said, I was amazed when Walt put me on to Lady Tremaine. But he said he must have seen something in my way of thinking that would work for this character.
Frank Thomas was anything but a wicked stepmother, but there was something always going on in his head. You'd go into his office and he would be searching for ways to communicate to you what he was trying to put into the scene. There was always some depth to the character he was trying to get.
Well, don't just stand there.
I think that Frank, the way he did the stepmother was absolutely the right way to do it. He worried some about it being too straight, but I think she had to be the way she was, because I think she's very frightening when she looks at you.
Ollie Johnston, Frank's best friend forever and ever, and his partner and collaborator in so many films, Ollie did the Wicked Stepsisters, who were so slovenly, so lazy, so ugly, so unappealing, that by contrast, Cinderella would look lovelier and lovelier.
Ollie Johnston didn't feel he was the best draftsman like, say, Milt Kahl was or Mark, and he couldn't analyze the scenes as much as, say, Frank did. But Ollie was very emotional. He just really worked from his heart.
Mother, do you realize what you just said?
Of course. I said, if.
The stepsisters were the broadest characters that I had done up to that point, certainly. Oh, a lot of scenes where I even went too broad. I remember one where Anastasia, she was smiling, you know, like that, silly smile. So I went real broad with that, thinking I'm going to get something really funny out of this. But finally, Walt called me in. He says, you know, she is a little bit ugly. Suppose you could fix that up.
Wolfgang Reitherman, born in Germany, came over here as a little kid. What Walt liked about him was his attitude. Wooly was a great suspense guy, and he thought a great idea for a scene is get that key up to Cinderella through that dizzying stairs setup that they had laid out.
I think that's one of the best sequences of suspense that we've ever had in a picture.
And it keeps building and building because we keep cutting back and forth. You know, the cat comes in the way, it's trying to stop them. It's like a Hitchcock film. It's unbelievable.
Ward Kimball probably had the most fun of anybody on Cinderella. He got the cat, Lucifer.
That was perfect casting because you could have never cast Ward Kimball on Cinderella. He would have fallen apart. He would not have enjoyed himself.
I didn't have to work making those very careful drawings of Cinderella and some of the other animators had to work on. And it was pure comedy, the old cat-mouse relationship. And my problem was to develop a cat that looked mean.
He had some funny stories about looking for a cat to be a personality like Lucifer, because they had mean cats and they had slinky cats and they had all different kind of cats drawn in the story sketches.
Walt came out the house here one day, and our six-toed cat we call Feetsy was rubbing up against Walt's leg. And he said, For gosh sakes, Kimball, there's your cat. What are you worried about? And that's what led to my conception of the cat.
At the time, he and I were playing in our Dixieland band, the Firehouse 5+2, and they'd always introduce Ward as the one who had done the mice in the Cinderella, and everyone go, "Oh!" Then St. Frank, they did the stepmother. Ugh. I said, we got to get another picture here, Ward. I can't take any more of this.
Ward Kimball got to do what he's best at, not staying within the forms of realism, but breaking out of that.
This great quality of going from real to unreal, that's always in Kimball's work. He was a fantastic, unique animator. You can look at his stuff on the screen and know it's Ward Kimball.
Ward's masterpiece of all his work he's done at Disney probably is the sequence where the cat is confused by which cup is hiding one of the mice. That is such a crazy but spontaneous sequence. It's as good as anything Chaplin has ever done. There are these two animation styles almost going on in the movie, when you have something like the cat and the mice, and then you have Cinderella and the stepmother, who are very real and have all these subtleties.
It's very difficult to animate human figures and to mix them with animals. It's just difficult. And Cinderella really succeeds well in that area.
Lucifer, you mean old thing.
You only got that by men who had grown from doing Snow White through Pinocchio, through Bambi, and Fantasia, and finally were able to do Cinderella.
The financial condition of the studio was such that they couldn't pour the lavishness into the production that they had on Fantasia or Pinocchio. So what they did was they shot the entire film in live action, and they used this as a guide to do layouts for the film, for the cutting, for the way the action would flow into one another.
They'd shoot live action and they'd blow it up to animation-sized paper, and then they'd put a sheet of animation paper on and draw right over it.
Some of the animators kind of, balked at that a little bit. They just like, I can do this, I don't need it.
If the live action was good, well, I use it, and if it wasn't, I didn't use it. And then I'd use the best parts of it, and I'd use it to help me enhance something, But I still didn't like to use it.
It is arguable that this is a less creative way of doing things. But the Disney artists were not the sort of artists who would just mindlessly trace over the live action.
They knew it had to be filtered through an artist's mind. And they had opinions on things, how something should move, and when it wasn't moving right in the live action, they would change it, and that's why it turned out so good, because they had a very critical eye.
If you look at some of the photographs that were taken and then the photostats that were made of it, and then you look at the final animation, you can see that there's an enhancement that the animators brought to it. The animators knew that you have to go further in animation than you do in live action, otherwise it's going to look stilted. Look at Frank Thomas's evil stepmother. There's a look about her that reminds you of actress Eleanor Audley, but he certainly goes further in her poses and in the way that she gestures and the way that she puts her points across on screen.
And one more thing. See that Lucifer gets his bath.
Ward Kimball had the luckiest role because the rest of us were sweating under all these restrictions of the live action we'd shot. They didn't shoot live action for him, and he wouldn't have followed it in the first place.
I was always looking forward to the next scene because it was fun.
It took us around 2 years to do it with all the experimental work in story and shooting the live action and that. But once we started animating it, it went quite fast. And we probably did the whole thing in 6 months. We all knew that it was a good picture because you could see it from the time we were shooting the live action on it. If Walt had been right in his vision of what the audience wanted, well, we'd be in business, and he was right. They just loved the picture.
Please, wait for me. Isn't it lovely? Do you like it? Do you think it will do?
As usual, the voice actors bring so much to an animated character, and the voices are so important.
Well, serves you right, spoiling people's best dreams.
I didn't know Disney was casting for the voice of Cinderella. I found out indirectly by doing a favor for two friends who wrote the music.
Eileen Woods supposedly got involved with the Cinderella project because Mac David and Jerry Livingston had known her from working in New York, and she was then in Hollywood.
They came to me to record their songs to present to Mr. Disney. But I didn't know that I would even be considered until, of course, Mr. Disney heard the recordings. And that's when the excitement started. That's when all the butterflies started batting around inside of my stomach when I was called to see Mr. Disney.
And when Walt heard her sing, he said, I want her to be the voice of Cinderella.
Yeah, that's a rare situation where the demo person actually gets the part because he used the demo just to show others, what they're looking for. And she got the part.
So this is love.
And the thing I like about Eileen's voice is it's a fairy tale voice. She almost whispers, "Now, Jacques."
Now, Jacques, what's all the fuss about?
No other Disney characters talks like this. It's just wonderful.
I know Walt, he'd been listening to a lot of girls, and he heard something in the voice that sounded to him like Cinderella.
And now I know.
And now I know the key to all is mine.
I got a call from my then agent. He said they were looking for a voice for Prince Charming.
So this is the...
I was married, and my twins were about 14 months old. And I remember how badly I needed that money, and I had no idea how important that would be.
Oh, my goodness.
What's the matter?
It's midnight.
Yes.
They auditioned me for the speaking role, and I was all excited about that. And the man said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Chicago." And he said, "I'm sorry, we can't use you in that speaking role." And if you heard me today, you'd say the same thing.
Why, then you must be...
Your fairy godmother?
And Verna Felton,
Where is that wand?
the voice of the fairy godmother, had a voice that was so warm.
But we'll have to hurry, because even miracles take a little time.
Just the perfect grandmother, the perfect fairy godmother. So much affection towards Cinderella. Just the way she comforts Cinderella in the garden.
Oh, come now, dry those tears. You can't go to the ball looking like that.
She starts out at Disney as the voice of one of those unpleasant elephants in Dumbo.
Pretend you don't see him.
And you don't like her. But that was Verna Felton, the character actress. The heart of Verna Felton is in the fairy godmother.
You must understand, my dear. On the stroke of 12, the spell will be broken.
She died on December 15th, 1966, the same day that Walt died. And she was a favorite of mine. I love the quality of her voice.
Bless you, my child.
Well, I always felt it was interesting that Betty Lou Gerson, who did the voice of Cruella de Vil, so harsh and raspy and domineering everything, she was the narrator who opened the story with this sweet, smooth voice.
Here in a stately chateau, there lived a widowed gentleman and his little daughter, Cinderella.
And I was amazed when I found out that she had done that. And as far as I know, that was the first picture she worked on for the studio.
Yes?
Frank Thomas's Lady Tremaine, the evil stepmother. There's a look about her that reminds you of the voice actress Eleanor Audley, who did the voice track.
Why, Cinderella, you're not ready, child.
I'm not going.
Not going? Oh, what a shame.
The whole studio just loved Eleanor Audley. I think they knew that they couldn't have found anybody better.
Cinderella?
She had authority. There's a command in her voice.
Don't think that
Hold your tongue.
There's sarcasm. There are so many qualities that are in that voice.
After all, we did make a bargain.
And then, of course, Frank's animation with that, it is powerful.
And I never go back on my word.
It's Eleanor Audley and me, because we worked and talked about these and we worked on how to do it. I liked where she's first lying in bed petting Lucifer, her cat, and telling Cinderella, said, "You have idle time on your hands, time for vicious practical jokes."
Now, let me see. There's the large carpet in the main hall. Clean it.
She made me jump every time she whirled around and so snapped. And her eyes were real strong.
But I just finished.
Do them again.
And then mellowed down again.
Then scrub the terrace, sweep the halls and the stairs, clean the chimneys, and of course there's the mending and the sewing and the laundry. Oh, yes. And one more thing.
And don't forget to give Lucifer his bath. You know, her voice had such color in it. And whenever you captured that in the drawings, it gave you a very satisfying feeling.
Cinderella! 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 She was raucous. She was a Brooklynese little brat.
I'd be honored, Your Highness. Would you mind holding my broom?
It was fun. She was very alive, I might say.
Give it here. Let me help.
She was not a passive girl. She was always into something. Mother, 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 mother!
Mother! You did it. You did it on purpose.
I really loved doing her part.
I remember that the voices on the Stepsisters were broad enough to give you inspiration to try to do more than you ordinarily would.
Every eligible maiden is to attend.
Why, that's us, and I'm so eligible.
It was amazing to be selected for a Disney show, and this was my first movie. It was the biggest thrill of my life. I tell you truthfully, I'm still thrilled about it.
I tell you, you can't believe the reaction that people, you know, even having done a television show for some 20 years, it was seen all over the country, and people say, "Did you do the voice of Prince Charming?" Yes. "Aren't you thrilled? Aren't you?" I said, "Yes, of course I am."
No matter how. Cinderella, I think, was one of my favorite stories. And I think my having gotten the part was a Cinderella story in itself, because it's being part of a legend. It really is. And there's nothing quite like that.
Will come true.
Walt Disney wanted to do something that had the feel of a Snow White, but new, different, or more magical.
So this is love.
The music in Cinderella is really key to the way the story is told in the film.
In keeping with Disney wanting to have an integrated piece of entertainment, the plot doesn't stop just for a song. It actually, you know, is integrated into the story itself.
Yes, I know it's a lovely morning, but it was a lovely dream, too.
Walt Disney was very serious about how he used music, just as serious as he was with the animation that he and his team created. So we look at Steamboat Willie, the first popular cartoon with synchronized sound. And we see that music is really the main part of the film. Mickey whistles from the very beginning. There's a musical performance that takes up more than half the cartoon. The very next thing that Disney does after several successful Mickey Mouse cartoons is he creates the Silly Symphonies, which is a series of cartoons based around musical performances.
And occasionally, some of those songs would turn out and become hits.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf?
But it was always kind of an accident, because the songwriter wrote songs for the picture, period.
Wait a minute. Get the idea first. The theme is pigs.
Let's put it in 4/4 time. All they were thinking about was telling the story perfectly, and a song usually worked.
How about Who's Afraid of the Big Old Wolf? No, it ought to be Big Bad Wolf.
Who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Big bad wolf.
But nobody expected Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf to become a hit, but it did.
Just whistle while you work.
And many of the songs in Snow White became commercial hits. It was freaky. Whistle While You Work and all that.
Pinocchio, of course, had a hit song with When You Wish Upon a Star.
I mean, they had all these wonderful songs that became hit songs, but they were not written for the market. They were written for the picture. And Walt Disney realized that with Cinderella, the whole studio depended on him. He didn't want to take a chance that maybe the public will go for this. He wanted pure songwriters who wrote for the commercial market. And so he realized Tin Pan Alley, the guys that write the hit songs.
Tin Pan Alley refers to the popular music publishing business in the United States. Tin Pan Alley really got started in the late 19th century. Many composers were part of a publishing industry. Tin Pan Alley was centered in downtown New York. It literally refers to 28th Street, where numerous publishers had their offices.
My dad was a songwriter, and he was one of the Tin Pan Alleyites. You know, he was there along with, it was like a big fraternity of writers, and they all conglomerated around. Well, at the time when my father was writing, there was a thing called the Brill Building, and so all the songwriters would gather there and play their songs for the various publishers. He'd say, yes or no, no, we got too many ballads, I don't need a ballad, I need a novelty, something about June or moon or something.
It was a whole different world then. And they would meet you on the street. They knew who I was, and they'd say, you got time? I want you to hear a song. And I would want to do almost every song I heard. They were so good.
But you had to come up with the wrinkle, the special thing to make it a successful song. And it was quite a remarkable world.
The three Tin Pan Alley songwriters that ended up working on Cinderella were Al Hoffman, Mac David, and Jerry Livingston. All had extensive experience working in the publishing industry.
Walt heard this novelty song. I remember it very well from junior high. It was very catchy.
It was called Chababa Chababa Chihuahua, a silly little funny thing. It was a gigantic hit.
That caught his ear, and he thought, that's the way I want to go with the musical score.
So he wanted to know who wrote it, and he was told these three guys wrote it. And then he wanted to know where were they. And he listened to some of their other songs. He said he wanted them to try something for Cinderella. So the first thing they came up with was A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes.
A dream is a wish your heart makes when you're fast asleep in dreams.
And Walt said, that'll do.
Jerry Livingston is quoted as saying, when Walt liked the song, he'd say, that'll work, to him. And my brother and I used to go crazy because all he ever said to us was, yeah, that'll work. And we never got wonderful, great, marvelous. It was just Walt's way. But if it would work, you knew it was in his picture.
Your rainbow will...
A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes, I loved. That was the very first song I sang in the film. And my daughter, she was old enough to see it by the time it came out. And when Cinderella starts singing to the mice and the birds,
if you keep on believing.
My little 3-year-old jumped up in the theater and yelled, that's my mummy, that's my mummy. And I know some lady sitting in front of us turned around and said, isn't that sweet? She thinks her mother's Cinderella. It was wonderful, it was fun.
Bippity Boppity Boo was a huge pop hit. I remember when it was a huge pop hit. And it's a great song. It's just a neat song to sing along.
It has that repetitive type of thing to children that catches their ear. It lasts forever, that song.
It'll do magic, believe it or not. Bippity boppity boo.
They had the work song, which was a big, big hit.
Cinderella, Cinderella, night and day, it's Cinderella. Make the fire, make the breakfast.
So they came up with 3 gigantic hits.
And we'll make a lovely bed for Cinderella.
Besides the 3 Tin Pan Alley songwriters in Cinderella, you also had 3 other very accomplished musicians working on this film. Oliver Wallace, Paul Smith, and Joseph Dubin, all of whom had worked on many, many Disney films before. Their music and Joe Dubin's orchestration really helped establish the rest of the sound for this film. When the mice are trying to get up the steps, or Lucifer is slinking around, or any kind of antics are taking place, the score is really giving us an idea of what this action is.
Nominated for Best Song, nominated for Best Score. So those guys did very well by Disney.
One interesting effect in Cinderella is the overdubbing technique that occurs during the Sing Sweet Nightingale sequence.
Walt Disney came in and listened to the song at the end of the day, and he sat there very quiet for about, I'd say 5 minutes. Everybody thought, he doesn't like it. And he said, I see a soap bubble coming up, and I see Cinderella's face, and I hear another voice, a harmony voice. And then I see another bubble coming up, and I hear another voice singing harmony. He said, we can do it. I know we can do it.
The guitarist and inventor Les Paul had experimented with overdubbing in the mid and late 40s, and so it had just really hit the mainstream.
That technique was new, and he wanted to utilize it as much as he could. So he realized, this is one way I can do it.
That's the way he was. When he said something could be done, nobody questioned him.
Cinderella marked the first time that Disney was actually going to publish the music through their own publishing company. And they started their own publishing company in part because they felt that the songs in Cinderella were going to be such big sellers that they might as well get the benefits of publishing the music themselves.
And that was a very big first. So a lot of wonderful things happened because of that decision.
The music was so infectious. It's something that stays with you for so long. There's not that much music around that's that way.
Clearly their idea that music was going to be a key part of Cinderella paid off, because not only was the soundtrack album a #1 hit, it sold 750,000 copies, but all the components of the sound for Cinderella were nominated for Academy Awards.
I know that the album, the record album, was #1 for a year over a lot of big albums. The Cinderella album sold #1 all over the world.
So this is... And 3 of the songs became hit parades and everything. It was just a wonderful, successful picture.
I felt so wonderful the night of the Cinderella premiere. And of course, Mr. Disney was there, and the animators were there, everybody that had anything to do with the making of the film, and it was a thrill.
It was a big success, bigger than Snow White. They had clothes, purses, you know, all the merchandise came out too.
When I saw Cinderella and heard it, well, I thought it was marvelous. Couldn't have been better. It was a great experience. I wouldn't take anything for that. I really wouldn't.
Why, it's like a dream. A wonderful dream come true.
I think it must have been amazing to be Walt Disney and to see that these things you dreamed were suddenly coming true.
It's more than I ever hoped for. Bless you, my child.
I know everybody I've talked to that, and back then, that saw the movie was just so thrilled with it. It's a wonderful, beautiful, happy movie. And I think that it lived up to every bit of the public's expectation.
There's magic. I mean, that old Disney word magic, it's there. It really is.
It made a person believe in dreams and dreams coming true.
It says, give us all the chance, we can all succeed.
Cinderella has been told many, many times, and I think the quintessential telling of it was Walt Disney's telling of it.
There's only one Cinderella.